Hello, I'm Irene Gina Reichel. Welcome to another edition of our series on focusing on China. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Dan Steinbock, who is a non-resident fellow of the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies and the founder of the global consultancy Difference Group. And he has done a lot of other interesting consultancies with major universities and institutes. His CV is posted for you all to see. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And the topic that we have chosen focuses on a report, actually two reports that you have written for the Shanghai Institutes about Corona, China, the world, missed opportunities. And since we're optimistic, we want to add perhaps new beginnings also. What were the main findings of your reports?
Well, there was quite a lot, but if I very quickly review the second report, well, let me say in the beginning that actually I thought it was very important to write these reports because at the time, the measures that I was looking for, multilateral international cooperation, were so badly missing. So that was the motive for this. The first report was the tragedy of missed opportunities. The second was the tragedy of more missed opportunities. And I think that the key issue that I found was that there was inability to seize those opportunities, particularly in early spring 2019. Now, then I looked at in the second report where this problems became paramount, and that was at the time in the Americas. But of course, we know it started in China, epicenter moves to Europe, then to US. But when we thought that it might have been contained, it wasn't. And then the so-called second wave started a lot earlier than we thought. But there were really about, I think, 4 major opportunities that were missed.
What were these major opportunities, these 4?
If we review them, number 1, the opportunity for early mobilization. And this, I think, was available after the WHO's, the World Health Organization's announcement of international emergency on the January 30th. There was a lot of debate internally, but they were ready, I think, to do it already on the 23rd, but it happened on the 30th. But their debate was also widely covered. What really was very distressing, and I found out this already in early, mid-March, early April, that the information was available to the Trump White House January the 3rd, but nothing happened. The information came to be available also for the European CDC and for strategic risk assessments. And for all kinds of reasons, there was no mobilization, there was no phased preparation and so on and so forth. Instead, there was an infodemic, an epidemic of fake news, etc., etc. Now, the second important stage was the late mobilization that happened in mid-March. However, I want to point out something. There was on the February the 4th, Dr. Tedros, the chief of the WHO, urged all the member countries of the WHO to provide country reports. They were missing. And perhaps out of politeness, he didn't say where they were missing from. But as a result, the WHO could not move very quickly forward with an international strategy. Now, when the virus was declared to be a pandemic, WHO said that they were deeply concerned by alarming levels of spread and severity, by alarming levels of inaction. And this was March the 10th. By then, the epicenter was in Europe, but rapidly moving to the US, first West Coast and East Coast, and finally Midwest. And the mobilization did start to happen, I think, 2 weeks after March the 10th. But then there were other issues, testing delays, faulty equipment, shortages, partly because of trade wars, and then an odd media battle against Dr. Tedros, against WHO and China, politicization, I felt. And the third was actually the half first half year of 2019, when the responses started to happen, but they were inadequate. There were quarantines, lockdowns, but there was no central coordination. Social distancing didn't happen appropriately. The thing that constantly alarms me and amuses me and stuns me is that, as I'm currently in Metro Manila, everybody's supposed to wear a face shield plus a face mask just going out. And to have this implemented in the early stages in January, my God, how much trouble we would have avoided. By then, of course, the economic costs were climbing, soaring, and the collateral damage was terrifying. And finally, the global spread, since it could not be contained after China, or China was able to successfully contain it, it would not be contained in Europe or US. Now it is spreading to emerging economies, developing economies. And that, I think, will be the worst of all, because there is a great villainy to do something about it, but not ability. So these were the 4 major stages that were missed. So when I say that perhaps we have now new beginnings, hopefully this year will be better.
You mentioned that China was able to contain the crisis, seems to have been able to contain the crisis quite well, and is probably the only major economy that will continue to grow in 2021. Now, China came out with a white paper on the corona crisis in early June 2020. And in that white paper, inter alia, China proposes a global effort to build up a global public health system, an efficient global public health system, and pledges also support to do that vis-a-vis developing countries. I mean, this is something that probably everybody should be doing, and not just the Chinese, because as you point out in your report very starkly, the cost for the developing economies, for the emerging economies is staggering.
Yes, if it's really bad, if in advanced economies, it's terrifying elsewhere. Let's be real about this. On January the 30th, when the alert became, for the first time, international alert by the WHO, I think the cumulative cases in the world were 7,800, and the deaths about 260. Now, next time, by the end of the March, when some mobilization had started to happen, the number of cumulative cases were 750,000, deaths 36,400. Yesterday or so, the cases are 107 million and the deaths 2.3 million. But this totally underestimates the countries in the low-income economies, perhaps also the lower middle-income economies and some of the upper middle-income economies that simply can't test. And then there are very odd issues about, not only about late testing, but why is it that even several advanced economies that had the ability to do so didn't? This goes up to Japan, it goes to Sweden. So I think that the Chinese motivation, there was a fair amount of idealism in it also, as there was a fair amount of idealism in the way that the people were mobilized in China to fight against this and to contain it. And I think ultimately that is absolutely what needs to happen. That in one way or another. The WHO had an independent commission also looking at the problems that they had. And they were also underscoring the fact that there needs to be multilateral international cooperation. That is the only way to avoid the next pandemic. If we don't take heed from those lessons in China, it is likely to happen again. But of course, not the countries outside China. They don't have the same political system. And so you need to have very focused, targeted ways of learning these lessons.
A renewed multilateralism has been called for by all the representatives of the UN system. But when we look at the realpolitische situation, then we have to say that actually multilateralism is under a lot of stress, and there is a very strong tendency in all the governments really to resort to a renationalization of attitudes and a renationalization of the attempts to deal with the corona crisis. So how do you see this going forward?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, I think it's very important to look at the lessons we learned from China in this regard. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that everything we learn has to be turned upside down. But there was one aspect I thought was very intriguing. And I remember in the early days of this crisis, around January, February, wondering aloud in some events, what will happen when these crises enter, say, the tri-state area in the United States? Because oftentimes the cooperation between the municipality, the state, and the federal powers lacks, it's missing. And I was also wondering aloud, how can you do this in Europe? Europe had the willingness, I think, to fight this from day one at the national level. But when some of the common institutions are missing, it is just very hard to do. And this comes in addition to the communication issues, the coordination issues with the European CDC and the European Union. So I think that one of the most important lessons that I feel I learned from China was not just the leadership and solidarity, which is very vital, but it's this multi-level cooperation between the national government, provincial government, municipal levels, and then the targeted focus areas. China was partly able to do it because it's still national level, even though the population is 1.4 billion. But my God, if we had been able to do this in Europe from the very early days on, I think that it would have been so much more helpful, particularly with very strong determination to work together on this. But I think that there were also other reasons that predated this crisis overall in terms of the problems with the multilateralism.
Yes, for sure. Multilateralism has suffered a lot of stress over the last several years. But there are also many signs that the corona crisis will lead to some new kind of imperialism, if you wish, or that the alliances around vaccines might again become imperialistic in one way or another. We see it from a number of countries, really. And it may be to the short-term benefit of developing countries, emerging economies, but can it be of lasting benefit?
You mean imperialism in the sense of the advanced economies being behind it, or the emerging economies being targets?
I think, for example, Russia has developed his own vaccine and is giving this vaccine to countries that are friendly. And China has pledged to developing countries to support them and give the vaccines free of charge to developing countries. Other powers, might be quite inclined to do similar things.
Absolutely. When we look at this problem of vaccine nationalism, as it became called, it is very distressing to look at if you look at the early coverage of those countries that can afford to vaccine and those that will come later. It was one of the WHO commissions that looked into this. And when you look at and map these countries, it really is a distinction between two kinds of countries, advanced economies and others. I think that, and of course it has already been discovered that if there had been a global coordination in this regard, simply the vaccination process and all the costs involved would have been so much cheaper than not. I think that the unilateralism that we've seen is apparent when you look at the WHO plans that they suggested, recommended in February, and then their updated plan in April. They're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps a few billions, which seems scary. But when you look at the probably 10, let's say 15 to $20 trillion that it will cost simply in fiscal packages, and you set aside the issue of monetary policy. In other words, rates that had to be cut down again. The costs are enormous. So yes, absolutely, there is a threat of this kind of reaction, and I think it has happened. But I think that what Russia is doing, what China is doing, is also a reaction to the absence of international cooperation. From the China's point of view, it was extremely distressing that the Chinese citizens, anybody who quote unquote looked Asian, was basically in a danger zone from January, February, and March, until it was understood that actually this can touch all of us, and it can be extremely detrimental. So that kind of internationalism that has been behind the China's initiatives, I'm pretty sure that it's still there. But of course, when countries find themselves cornered in the absence of global coordination, then they do what they can. And so to my mind, it was a defensive reaction on the part of the emerging economies. And what is really needed is this kind of international multilateral cooperation across all political differences. I think we are now getting to a point in our history as a humanity that if we fail in that, we are causing planetary collateral damage.
And that is perhaps what we are alluding to when we are talking about the hope for a new beginning, no? That this crisis actually is a wake-up call. It's for sure not going to be the last pandemic that afflicts humanity, because we all know that the circumstances are such that there will be more pandemics. But can we learn from this pandemic? And if we learn, what should we learn? And who can take the lead?
Well, first of all, I think it has been so difficult because the crisis was predated by the crisis of the global cooperation. Now, if you remember or recall the crisis of 2008 and 9, that was the time when Strauss-Kahn at the IMF was able to hammer a platform that was acceptable to the advanced and emerging developing economies. That has been missing sorely here. So as a result of the 2008 crisis, the European debt crisis, there has been slowing global growth, more so in the part of advanced economies. The monetary stimulus honestly has been used and abused for quite a long time. And the costs are accruing because you can't simply print money without it having serious consequences in terms of monetary policy. And then those are followed by market corrections. When you look at in purely practical terms, in the 2 years prior to this crisis, I was extremely concerned that the global recovery that was in the making in 2017 fell apart. The investment levels prior to this crisis were still down from the peak levels 2007. Trade wars undermined the recovery as such. United States has now a higher trade deficit than prior to the trade wars, which should be a lesson in terms of what not to do in the future. And most importantly, there are 70 million displaced people in the world because of the migration crisis and wars and conflicts, which will be a lot worse after this one. One would think that we don't want to see what happened in Yemen, for instance, in the cases of this crisis, where you had an economic crisis, political crisis, military crisis, and even a humanitarian crisis, that you wouldn't like this to happen elsewhere in the world. But it's likely to happen unless we take it seriously. The reason I'm trying to be optimistic is that, as you know, only yesterday there was an interim press conference by the WHO mission in China. Mm-hmm. And their attitude of calm, cautious, science-based risk assessments on which you build public policy, I think this is the way to go. And for the best of it, it's hard for me to understand why we can't create more multilateral cooperation mechanisms, starting with the G7 countries. They still lead the world in terms of the volume of economic power. That would be the major Western European powers, United States and Japan. And then the major emerging economies, some would like to call them BRICS, but honestly, you don't have a major African country among the BRICS like Nigeria and so on and so forth. But creating a new kind of forum on that basis might take us into far more positive horizons, as long as each country plays or has to play defense. It will simply not happen. We need that multilateral commitment.
Mm. I remember very vividly the discussions that we had perhaps 10 years or 15 years ago already in multilateral settings about global public goods. And global public goods, you know, one of the global public goods that was always cited was health, because you cannot have an absence of infectious disease unless there is a production of the global public good, which is cooperation in health issues. And I think this pandemic has shown very clearly, you know, how right these discussions were. But at the same time, why is it that humanity or that the international community is not able to act on insights that should be so crystal clear that we can only be as safe as the most vulnerable are in health issues? I mean, health, global public health, clearly depends on the weakest link in the chain, right? We cannot hope to protect ourselves unless everybody is protected.
Absolutely. And I think that this is the key point, the one you mentioned, in that this should be a moral issue, it should be an economic issue, and it should be simply a global health issue. What I mean by this is that thinking in those terms, that the weakest link will affect the rest of the network, which has been the case with the pandemics, which is also a virtuous circle in positive globalization, if you will. That's the key, because in this particular case, there was no moral solidarity that would have been tangible at the international level, and that would have contained the crisis earlier. There was no pragmatic understanding that actually, if we do this early, we save so much money. It would be so much cheaper. We would have avoided the fiscal packages. We would have avoided the monetary rates having to be cut again, and so on and so forth, which we can't afford in the first place. This will create a massive debt crisis in a matter of time in the Western countries. And United States could lead it in the sense that their debt per GDP now is coming close to 130%. Now that's at the level of Italy prior to the European debt crisis. The difference is that lira is not a global
exchange currency, yeah.
Correct, reserve currency, but the dollar is. We can't have this kind of situation. It has to be more diversified. Mm-hmm. I think that one sanction that we will feel soon, and we are getting to see some signals of it, quiet signals and not so quiet signals, are the variants associated with the virus here. We knew from day one that the more you have cases, the more you will have mutations. Most of the mutations won't be so bad, maybe 9 out of 10, but it's the 10th or the 100th that can. Now, some examples, for instance, the one we've seen in UK, Brazil, South Africa, are potentially at that level. And when that happens, then you have to rethink, okay, now how are we going to deal with the vaccination at the global level? We're going to have boosters. Oxford AstraZeneca, that many people thought, rightly so, could be a pioneer of this. We find out that actually their method in its current form may not be enough to contain the crisis here. So there will be sanctions coming very quickly, and these are not new ones. Only 2 months before the crisis officially started in late January, there were pandemic simulation exercises in the United States, in certain Ivy League universities, where many of the problems were clearly mapped. The Chinese researchers have been warning for the past 10 years that this is an accident waiting to happen. Mm-hmm. So like you, I believe that I'm hoping that if it's not the multilateral cooperation that will bring us together voluntarily, I'm afraid that it will be the next crisis that will. But by then, we will lose a lot more in terms of economics. We will lose a lot more in terms of goodwill among the countries. And we will have far more collateral damage in terms of human lives and human injuries.
Mm. Since we are coming close to the end of our conversation, what would be the one thing that you recommend to seize the opportunities that are present in this crisis?
In those reports, I had a couple of scenarios. What could happen from now on? And what would happen in a baseline case? What would happen in the conflict case? What would happen in a cooperative case? I think personally, this is just my personal view, that as under the Trump administration, which had a very clear America first stance, you cannot blame it for not being consistent, it was. It was so clearly unilateral that it was almost impossible to change the situation at the global level. Now, Biden administration, to the degree it proved to be like the Obama administration, I think is far more multilateral, at least in its basic stance. Then the question is, can the United States and China agree to disagree about so many other things and find their way peacefully without a catastrophe, working together? So I tend to think, perhaps in the realpolitik sense that you mentioned earlier, that it is really the relations between US and China at all levels that will affect the next solution. What I would like to see is something that would be comparable, perhaps idealistically so. If you remember the time in the 70s when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat simply was so tired and weary of the costs, human costs, economic costs of these endless wars, that he flew to Tel Aviv, started talking with the Israelis. My personal view is that that initiative was then the opportunity was not seized appropriately, which accounts for its demise. But what if we could have the major BRIC powers, the major G7 powers, simply getting around the same table saying that what we've done here, what we've seen here is terrible. This cannot happen again. What can we do about this? If it cannot be under the auspices of G20, then some kind of other multilateral forum, could be Kreisky Forum, could be anything that brings people together, and so that you can really address these issues, but without the politics. The problem with that approach was, whether it's right or wrong in certain cases, that it ignored the science-based public health risk assessments. And that takes us back to the global health that you mentioned. And I think that these crises are now so serious. We've seen political crisis, we've seen economic. We haven't seen a pandemic yet. We can see chemical crisis soon, biological warfare, all kinds of things. You cannot affect these things in a positive way, contain them without cooperation. So it's just stunning to somebody who writes this report how much good opportunities were missed, and how much and how little it would require in terms of containing this in the long term. I would think that it speaks for new beginnings. I would hope so.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights on this topic with our viewers at the Kreisky Forum. I think many will like your idea that the Kreisky Forum could perhaps take more of an initiative in that respect as well. I express the hope that we can welcome you perhaps in Vienna at some point when we are able to travel again and to meet in person again. In the meantime, thank you very much for your time. I will stop the recording now. We can still chat a little bit after I stop the recording.
Sure.